The reverse meditations are really brilliant because they vastly expand our notion of what meditation and contemplative practice is by bringing unwanted experiences onto the path. And so in this age of the meta crisis, have you noticed? There's no shortage of unwanted experiences. And so do we run from them or do we work with them? And so the reverse meditations, they're called reverse because you reverse your normal feel-good strategies. Authentic psychospiritual growth is not about feeling good, unless you're talking about the fundamental teaching of basic goodness. It's about getting real. And getting real means dealing with challenging situations, like old age, sickness, and death, or everything else that's happening in the world. And so with this extraordinary skill set, armed with this skill set and the steps of working with it, one can take even the most challenging, like death, you could say, arguably the most unwanted of all experiences. Well, if you relate to it properly, using reverse meditation strategies, obstacle transforms into opportunity, and it is the most transformative of all experiences. And so I playfully say, by putting your meditation in reverse, you'll find yourself going forward. Because with the reverse meditations, nothing can interrupt your meditation. Interruption becomes your meditation. Nothing can distract you because distraction becomes your meditation.
Welcome to Inner Pioneers, a podcast for those who feel the call to break new ground within themselves. Join us as we dive into real stories of transformation and learn from leading voices in psychology, science, and human development on how to move through inner shifts and seasons of change. I'm your host, Dimitri Axelrod, and now let's begin pioneering. Andrew Holecek is an internationally acclaimed author, scholar practitioner, and longtime teacher in Tibetan Buddhism and non-dual wisdom traditions. Andrew has spent more than 30 years helping people turn life's deepest challenges and most mysterious states, such as pain, death, sleep, dreams, and even darkness, into gateways for awakening. He completed the traditional 3-year Tibetan Buddhist meditation retreat, is one of the West's leading voices on dream yoga and lucid dreaming, and has guided nearly 1,000 people through his Preparing to Die program. Andrew holds degrees in classical music, biology, and a doctorate in dental surgery. Andrew, good evening or good morning. Thank you for being on tonight.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. Nice to spend time with you. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. So Andrew, you are a renowned teacher in Tibetan Buddhist practice. You have written extensively about very interesting ways of doing introspection, dream yoga, but also now a new book will be coming out about darkness retreats and darkness exposure, which I hope we can talk about today. But before we dive into these areas of specialties, I would love to hear how you actually found your way to Tibetan practice. And when I read about your life in the beginning, you were experimenting with many methods and it didn't seem to be easy for you, right? So this quest was coming out of a certain longing to end suffering, if you will.
Yeah. So how did I get into this business? Well, I think one pretty seminal and transformative event was I was 20 years old, studying at a big university, doing a pretty challenging kind of double degree pursuit. So super busy, super active. Was diagnosed with some symptoms that were consistent with high blood pressure, hypertension. Went to my health sciences center. They said, yes, indeed, hypertension. So they prescribed exercise, diet regulation, and some medication. And I said, I'm 20 years old. I'm not going to take any medication. And so changed my diet, increased my exercise. And at that time, which is quite a while ago, there was some initial data coming out about the benefits of transcendental meditation for reducing things like hypertension. So I went to a introductory session, happened to be on campus. I was impressed by the individual who did the presentation, signed up for my first session. And long story short, over a period of maybe, an hour to the first introduction, my mind, was introduced to this mantra, and my mind dropped into a complete state of cessation, absorption. which I attribute to beginner's luck. And so it introduced a dimension of awareness consciousness that I didn't even know was possible. No breath, no, no thought, no mental contact whatsoever, just ecstatic cessation. And that really launched the whole thing, because it was like, oh my gosh, what is this? How can I stabilize this? How do we get more of it? So that started, it was a major before and after experience. Yeah, I suppose it would be like taking a super powerful psychedelic. This wasn't a psychedelic, I guess, silver psychedelic. And so that launched everything. So then it was like, okay, well, how do I stabilize this? How do I enhance it? I kept up my TM, my transcendental meditation practice. It did stabilize. There wasn't much of a path to it in those years. So there wasn't really something to follow up with formally with them. I was just kind of on my own. And then, yeah, I had another set of really powerful experiences a couple of years later, where I finished my undergraduate studies and was trying to figure out what to do for postgraduate work. Took a year off. And again, another long story short, started having very interesting dreams. They're called precognitive dreams, dreams predicting something about to happen. And so I spontaneously, I guess I was 23, I entered this so-called altered state, which at this point, I don't see that retrospectively. I thought it was a glimpse of the natural state. I actually see this conventional reality as the altered state. And one characteristic of this that was seminal for me was virtual constant lucidity. Dreams, all my dreams for about 2 week period were lucid. Even my sleep was lucid. And then correlatively, my waking reality was more dreamlike. And so super interesting for a couple of weeks. Then it got a little bit challenging because I lost my footing in reality. So it was like what I thought might have been a glimpse of awakening was maybe a glimpse of insanity. But basically, that pointed out a very profound kind of introduction to dreams, the power of dreams, lucid dreaming. And then, yeah, I started poking around, exploring, reading. There wasn't a lot of literature published way back then, but I came across the Tibetan teachings on Buddhism, actually, in general, the root of the word Buddha, right? Buddha literally means awakened one. So I thought that was interesting. And then when I learned about the dream yoga tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, it's like, well, geez, maybe maybe I'm a Buddhist. But always reminding myself that the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, right? He was just a guy who woke up. So yeah, I guess you could say I'm a card-carrying Buddhist I playfully say for tax purposes. But more than anything, I'm a curist. I'm just intensely curious about the nature of mind and reality. And I explore it in a number of different ways, including a pretty systematic, rigorous exploration of the nocturnal mind. So yeah, something like that.
Well, super interesting. I mean, it seems like you had the luck, you might say, to experience such a deep state. And I heard it was both fascinating, but also destabilizing, right? And even
Totally.
kind of worrying, like, what is happening to me and am I losing my mind? And still you decided to pursue it and to seek also the guidance of more experienced people in that field. You ended up deciding to join a 3-year retreat, which is like difficult, I guess, to imagine for me and probably to most people, right? To go on retreat and practice for 3 years. What made you believe it was a good idea to do that?
Yeah, it's another big one. Yeah. So it was a good idea to do it because at that point I had been studying very rigorously, very systematically the vast corpus of the Tibetan Buddhist teachings, just consuming a 12-year very rigorous cycle of teachings with my main teacher, Khenpo Tsotrong Gyamtso Rinpoche. And it's like I studied so much material, but I hadn't fully incorporated it. I hadn't really digested it. It was more just at the level of intellect. And so I realized that in order to really bring this into my life, I had to slow down and really practice what has been preached. And so I went into this retreat for 3 years and radically changed my life. It was one of the most impactful thing I've ever done. It's like meditation university. You don't just do one meditation. I probably did 60 different practices over the course of these years. So it was just a magnificent exploration of the depth of the human condition. And yeah, I mean, I've just been unpacking the insights from that retreat, which is well over 20 years ago at this point. Ever since, first book I wrote when I came out of that retreat was about my experience, called The Power and the Pain, about the extraordinary power of really deep inner work and also the challenges, the pain of waking up. It's not easy to wake up. It's like a detox. And so, yeah, ever since then, I've just been propelled even deeper into the extraordinary depths of the mind and the heart. And for me, I continue to do it because it's fundamentally the only game in town. We take a very close look at our experience. we're always working with our mind because fundamentally there's nothing else. Having an experience without mind just doesn't even make sense. So whether you call it experience, whether you call it mind, take a look at your own experience. You're always working with your mind. Hard stop. So take a look. If it's true, why not work with it directly? So I wanted to transform. I wanted to be a better human being. I wanted to be more kind and less selfish and more compassionate. And so ever since then, haven't looked back. I'm propelled by the 3-year retreat. I still engage in annual retreats. My daily practice is fairly rigorous. And it's really just what drives it all is just this longing that you mentioned at the outset to remove any level of dissatisfaction / suffering, to see if there is in fact this thing called awakening, enlightenment. What is that? How does one actualize that? And yeah, how to take full advantage of this extremely short and very precious life.
Hmm. And so you said that this 3-year period was probably one of the most powerful experiences you've undergone in your life. And when you reflect about it from today's point of view, like, who did you think you were when you went into that retreat, and who did you think came out?
Yeah, right. Okay, that's a nice question. So, I mean, on one level, I think answering the question, who am I, is another way of answering it. You could say it's the core inquiry, the core investigation. The Greeks had it, right? Know thyself at I think Temple of Apollo at Delphi. So Rama Maharshi's central inquiry, who am I? I think if you answer that question, that's one way to talk about what awakening actually is. So I suppose when I came in, my identity was still fairly consolidated at this most exterior, superficial, most somatic, body-based appearance. Ego's first and foremost body ego, Freud, ego's exclusive identification with form, Eckhart Tolle. And so that just made a lot of sense. So I came in, I suppose, pretty solidified, reified entity who this label Andrew has been appended to. And then, yeah, going through this kind of detox, whatever you want to call it, acid bath over 3 years, it was just a very profound dissolution dying process. This is one reason I'm so deeply interested in what's called the Bardo literature of Tibetan Buddhism, where this is the body of teachings that explores end of life and death. And so I suppose going through this dissolution, demolition derby, the deconstruction that takes place with really, really deep, intensive inner work, transitioning my identity from exclusive identification with outer form into the interior, kind of subtle body dimensions of my being, and all the way down to the groundless ground of what so many wisdom traditions call as the non-dual essence of my being. And so, I mean, I don't live from that space. I'm still very much a work in progress, but there is something about the profound reiterative pointing out of these dimensions of being for so many years repeatedly that stabilization to a certain extent is brought about, levels of insight brought about. And so continues my path, is to make it even more and more stable, more and more familiar, until, as Houston Smith put it so beautifully, transform flashes of illumination into abiding light. So, yeah, something like that.
Wow. And so if I imagine, young Andrew walking in, identifying himself as, yeah, well, this mind, this personality, this body, this personal and familiar history, etc. And then these edifices, these concepts of the mind are being dissolved. They take an acid bath, as you said it. I think it has immense revelatory potential. It can be also pretty frightening to think of not knowing who I am or where I belong. And I think you've once cited Trungpa Rinpoche, who said, well, the bad news is you're kind of falling through the air. There's nothing to hold on to. There's no parachute. But also on the upside, there's also no ground to hit. So nothing can happen. But still, have you ever questioned your choice and felt like, is this the right way? Is this the same path? Is it helpful, or is it rather kind of destabilizing?
Well, it's both. It's both, because we exist along a very sophisticated, complex spectrum of identity along at least two axes. We can say a lot about that. So we don't exist along one locus, one space-time coordinate. Our identity is always shifting, even moment to moment. You talk about concepts. What happens in extended retreat is you realize that space, time, causality, the very sense of self, what we talk as the givens, the axioms, These are all constructs. They're literally made up. And they're made up over and over on the spot repeatedly. It's not some constant thing that happened in the past, some original sin. These are constructs that are actively being reconstructed all the time. And so when you do intensive deep inner work, you see this magnificent construction process. Ego, in my playful language, is the world's most efficient, fastest construction company. In the blink of an eye, ego, you open your eyes, you create, co-create. There is no world out there. There is no color, there's no shape, there's no dimensionality. These are all enacted the moment you open your eyes. And co-emergent with that is the very sense of self. Self and other lean on each other, they co-emerge. And so by understanding this, then you understand where some of the anxiety, some of the fear, some of the challenges may come from. Because if you see yourself existing along these two axes as the spectrum of identity, then you understand that there's part of you in this identity spectrum, you could say the ultraviolet, more evolved aspect, that really does want to wake up, is interested in transcendence and evolution. But then you have on the infrared end this devolutionary tail that wags the dog, this lower bandwidth of identity that wants nothing to do with it. And so that's where the fear comes from. That's where the resistance comes from. That's where all the challenges come from. And so understanding the nuanced dimensions of our identity can therefore help us understand what's taking place when we go through these dissolution processes. And for instance, like, why do we continue to do this? Why do we continue to freeze the world in this way? So this is where the spiritual traditions dovetail beautifully with the Western developmental disciplines, psychology, anthropology, structuralism, developmental processes. And so I think to me, it's super important to work again along both these axes. I just intimated one, spiritual dimension, but then you have the kind of structural, developmental, psychological dimension. So we're working along both these vectors, whether we know it or not. Understanding this to me is like, again, it's everything else is a substitute. You're either working with your mind, you're relating to your mind, or from it. And relating from your mind is no relationship at all. That's reactivity. That's just being buffeted around by the contents of your mind. That's what it means to be asleep in the psychospiritual sense. So waking up to the contents of mind, relating to it, from it, now you have a choice. Now you can relate to your mind in the reality that's disclosed by that mind in a much more lucid way. We mentioned earlier lucid dreaming, dream yoga. Well, this is archetypal lucidity and non-lucidity. So this is what it means to truly wake up in the deepest sense, using the nighttime dream as a way to wake up to this dream. But that's a slight sidebar.
So many things to unpack for me. And I mean, one of the things I love about your way of thinking or approaching these questions is that you do not restrict yourself solely to, let's say, the traditional contemplative or meditative path, but that you also incorporate modern or Western approaches of understanding the mind from a psychological, also from an adult developmental perspective. These are basically, as Ken Wilber says, different lines of development that we can take and actually also need to work on, both on our kind of spiritual dimension, but also our psychological maturity. And I want to come back to that later if we still have time, because otherwise I feel I will get lost in the woods. But like one more question I had to this 3-year-long retreat is really, when you came back, how was it for you to kind of step back into this former world with your friends and family, and they might have found an utterly different person in front of them, right? How was this integration for you? Was it easy? Did you struggle? How was it?
Definitely not easy. But where does growth take place, Dimitri? You're not going to grow when you're working on your suntan or hanging out in the hot tub, right? You grow when you're stretched. So yeah, it was extraordinarily challenging. I lost my job, my house, my wife. I mean, it was like a death. Everything was released. But for me, again, it was extraordinarily painful. Hence the book, Power and the Pain. But it was also profoundly revelatory, revealing. And for me, it was choiceless. This underlying drive, longing to wake up, really, it's the only authentic path for me that there is. So yes, it was very difficult. And the integration thing, just like with psychedelics or any other really powerful transformative journey, that's a massive, in fact, you say the most important part, because you can have these amazing experiences. So what? I mean, so what? You can become a state junkie. You just addicted to certain states of consciousness. So, the point is to transform states into traits, stable qualities. And so coming out the integration thing, that's an ongoing journey. That's why I keep going back into retreat to restabilize, to strengthen. That's why I expanded to new practices like dark retreat to stabilize and to integrate. It's an ongoing journey, the process of integration and incorporation, which literally the word means to turn into a body. Incorporation means, like in this case, to take the experience, take the teachings, and turn it into to the very structure of your being. So yeah, it was really difficult. It really was. I use several metaphors. It's like a fasting. It's like a detox. It really is like dying. We're dying. In this case, represents transformation. It's not easy, but again, take a look at your own experience. Where does growth take place? So one has to be willing, in my understanding, to step out of our comfort zones, to step into the challenge zones, and look at the world, and look at ourselves in new ways. Otherwise, we're just stuck in our habit patterns, our perception boxes, until the day we die, when all these boxes dissolve on nature's non-negotiable terms, and then you're left to face, if the non-dual traditions are accurate, these deepest dimensions of your experience on non-negotiable, uncompromising terms. And so the traditions often say, die before you die. Letting go is a euphemism for death. Meditation is death in slow motion. So that's where these teachings then again tie into the whole Bharata yoga, the death practices. They're intimately connected. At the deepest levels, you can't separate one from the other. You can't have life without death and death without life. They also co-emerge. So you can work with both.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's a very powerful testimony of the transformation often has a price, right? And the price is letting go that which feels known and comfortable, and allowing things to die so something new can be born in that space, right? It's like every fire creates the fertile ashes for the next generation of green to pierce through it. Wow. And so when we talk about this spiritual path, and I know this term itself is, it might be a bit problematic and you have challenged it in the past, but
Yeah,
still,
definitely.
when we think about it, or look at it from a Buddhist perspective, right? One of the most fundamental truths that the Buddha has spoken was that, well, there is suffering in life, right? And there are kind of causes and conditions causing suffering, but there is also a way to end them.
Totally.
From your point of view, what is the root source of most of our suffering?
Well, that's obviously a major, beautiful question. And here's the thing. The first noble truth in the Buddhist tradition is the truth of suffering, which really is just truth of dissatisfaction. But this is only in the realm of conventional reality. We only suffer in conventional reality. We suffer because we don't know what's real. We suffer because we don't know who we are. Again, this is archetypal non-lucidity, ignorance. The word is fundamentally just ignorance. So if we continue, just to show you how deep this is, if we continue to see the world in a dualistic way, solid, lasting, and independent, the very things that we again take to be as given scaffoldings of reality, me in here, you out there, we're going to suffer in direct proportion to that wrong view, to that kind of pathological view. And so the principal reason is we suffer because we just don't know. We don't know what's real. We don't know who we are. And because of that, we subscribe, very specifically, we suffer because we subscribe to this ridiculous notion of materialism and duality, which again, for most of the Western world, that's just the way it is. The world is made of matter and a materialistic world, and we live in a world of duality. No, we don't. These are constructs. No one has ever experienced matter. Matter is an inference. Matter is just a label we append to the regularity of experience. There's no such thing as matter. So that's an inference, but if we subscribe to that, we suffer. If we subscribe unwittingly to a dualistic world, we suffer. And so that's one kind of spiritual dimension. We fundamentally just don't know. Appearance is not in harmony with reality, so we don't know. On a more developmental, kind of psychological level, we suffer because of this kind of arrested form of development, constipated form of development called ego structure. There's nothing inherently wrong with ego, by the way. Ego is a very, very necessary, important stage in human evolution. If we didn't have egoic structure, we wouldn't be here talking about the nature of egoic structure. So we need it in order to survive. We need to separate self and other. We need that for our immune systems to work. Antigen antibody doesn't work without that. So the issue is not this particular stage of human development, but our exclusive identification with it and the lack of recognition that it's an arrested form of development. And so those are the two principal kind of psycho-spiritual reasons why we suffer. We don't know what's real. We don't know who we are. And we identify virtually exclusively with form, which is also connected to the materialism thing. So I'll pause there because this is obviously a massive question, but something along those lines is what works for me.
Well, so two arguments basically. It's we don't really know, we are confused about what's real, and we cling to our identification with form. If you said to, let's say, a regular person who's not into Buddhism, well, your suffering is an illusion, and most of what you consider to be real is an illusion. I'm not sure this is really helpful for them. In a sense, they will swear, and I mean, so can I say, well, my suffering feels very real. My depression feels real, and no matter how I think about it, it's not so easily changeable.
I agree with you 100%. It all depends on how you define illusion. Illusion doesn't mean it's not real. Illusion means appearance is not in harmony with reality. Just like in a dream. This is why the dream arena is so helpful. If you're in a normal, non-lucid dream, this is a dream when you don't know that you're dreaming, you mistake the contents of your dream to be real. You think there's a dreamer, you think there's a dream world, and you can have nightmares. You can literally scare yourself to death, not metaphorically, literally. And so again, we suffer in the dream because we mistake. We don't know that we're dreaming. We don't know it's all just a manifestation of your mind. Appearance is not in harmony with reality. The monster appears, it seems solid, it seems real, you're scared, crapless in there. Well, the minute you become lucid, the minute you realize, wait a second, this is just a dream, this is just my mind, in that moment of lucidity, the tables are immediately turned. The appearance is still there. Whatever's there, the monster, whatever, it's still there. But with lucidity, you see through it now. You have the capacity to see through it. So what you're saying is 100% right. And so what we do is we cultivate what William Blake talked about is this double vision, the capacity to keep one eye on absolute truth and one eye on relative truth. So relative truth is a truth of appearance. You can't deny that. You can't deny the fact that I appear this way. There appears to be something out there. And all the laws of physics and science and whatnot work on this relative conventional reality basis. You can't deny that. That's total classic spiritual bypassing, spiritual materialism. It leads to a host of really serious psychospiritual pathologies. So what you do is like Plato, Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. You question the appearance. What is the status of this appearance? How real is it really? Well, it's not nearly as real as we think it is. Yes, there's something that appears. But what is the status of that appearance? So you keep one eye on relative truth, otherwise you and I wouldn't be talking, otherwise we couldn't communicate in this world. But then you also develop a new kind of almost X-ray vision that allows you to see the underlying reality behind the appearance. That's the absolute truth. What is it? What is appearance actually made of? What is reality actually made of? And so then you keep your eye on both these truths. And if you do that, I guess that's one way to talk about what awakening might actually be. The capacity to keep an eye on both relative and absolute, functioning in both worlds. And this allows you to be completely effective in the world at large, to be in the world but not of it. And I mean, my understanding is this is part of what the awakening journey is all about. So you can still operate in the world, you can communicate, you can write, you can help. In fact, you do so better than before. But you're no longer subscribing, right? You're no longer falling into the trap of externality, of solidity, of a reified, dualistic, materialistic world, because you have a better, higher view. Literally, Buddhism talks about it as right view. So to me, this is really important. And by the way, parenthetically, if you only have the absolute view, there's a host of problems associated with that. The non-dual traditions that I think are wonderful, but there's blind spots everywhere. You mentioned very briefly that I roll in all these different worlds. Well, I do, because nobody has a patent on truth, and I'll get it wherever I can find it. And so every discipline has its light and its shadows, and the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. So the non-dual traditions can very easily slide into a non-dual absolutism which I think is massively pathological. It doesn't recognize psychological pathologies, doesn't recognize the ability of working with developmental levels of growth. It puts everything in the absolute basket. And I think that's a massive disservice to the complexity of the human condition. So this is part of the integral approach that I roll with, why I work with all these different traditions. And even in the spiritual realm, yes, I guess I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, like I mentioned earlier, for tax purposes. But there, Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Shaiva Tantra, Taoism, I mean, Sufism, there's so much wisdom in this world. And I think opening the aperture of our hearts and our awareness to include all these streams, to me, is keeps us open, keeps us humble, and keeps us forever learning. Because the minute we think we've got it all together, and the minute we think we know what's going on, that's the end of our growth. That's the end of our progress. So endless beginner's mind, endless humility. I'm thrilled to have people point out blind spots to me. I love engaging in debate with scientists, philosophers, traditions from others, because we don't see what we don't see by definition. I mean, that's what a blind spot is. So to me, part of waking up is having blind spots pointed out, being willing to have these pointed out, which is not always pleasant, because it means letting go of even not just egoic structure, but all these belief systems that we unconsciously or consciously harbor.
I mean, this resonates very much with me, and especially this approach that we need to be able to hold the paradoxes of these both levels. And there are two things that come to mind. There's one story about a Zen master that I've heard who was crying and sobbing deeply and shedding tears, and then one of his student shows up and says, like, "Master, why are you crying?" And he says, "Well, I just lost my child." And the student asks, "But aren't you teaching us this here is all an illusion?" And he says, "Yes, and losing a child is the biggest one."
Very
Right?
painful
Kind of
illusion.
the pain of it is the biggest one. And I feel like this captures, like, so beautifully and succinctly, like, what you've just said. I mean, the pain here is real, right? This human vulnerability and this heart that is shattering, it is part of the human condition. And I guess it's also what makes us human. It's what allows us to become compassionate and extend beyond our own narrow definitions of self-interest when we feel connected to humanity through our own pain, through our suffering. And at the same time, if we only remain on that level, it is crushing, right? It is debilitating, and it puts us almost kind of in a victim role. And when we forget that there is also something more absolute, this is where this spaciousness and the sense of liberation comes in. And this is what I guess Ram Dass often said in his lectures, you need to be, if you're only up there somehow, with the celestial beings, you will become completely detached from reality, and you will become a psychopath, because you see somebody falling down and you're saying, well, it's karma, bitch, get up, You can't do only that. At the same time, if you're only stuck on this level of human suffering, it will crush you. And so balancing these two levels, I think this is kind of the art of the path.
100%. I mean, that level of fluidity is really characteristic of so-called awakening. But you're playing on a couple, I think, compelling things. One is the capacity to deal with irony, contradiction, and paradox. I mean, I can't remember. I think maybe Suzuki Roshi actually said, if it's not paradoxical, it's not true. And so we wrestle, when we look at non-duality through a dualistic lens, you get irony, paradox, contradiction, because non-duality doesn't fit into shrink-wrapped dualistic concepts. So the capacity, what's called dialetheism, the capacity or complementarity in physics, the daimonic principle in mythological traditions, the capacity to be whole different perspectives, this kind of multi-perspectivalism, is absolutely important. And having a mind and heart that's ready to deal with paradox, because reality itself is not paradoxical. Reality is ineffable. And the minute you try to F the ineffable, you're going to F it up. This is Alan Watts, right? And so this is really important, that at a certain point, and this is why talking about it only goes so far. This is why I think philosophy, to me, if it's not in the most sophisticated way, to me is a pejorative term, limited, because philosophy is not going to change you. You don't change when you think about things. You change when you feel things. So to me, this is why, yes, I love philosophy. Don't get me wrong. I love the sciences. I love psychology. But like I mentioned, half an hour ago, my charter in life is transformation, praxis. How does one transform? One transforms by doing this really deep, intense work that involves incredible purification and understanding of things, literally bringing the teachings into one's being. This is core to me. And this is why I just get bored to tears. I don't even go to philosophical scientific conferences unless they work with some level of praxis transformation. Second thing is, the importance of what you're talking about here, when one works with these different dimensions of reality and can honor and be with both these dimensions equally, then there's this beautiful maxim that as one progresses on the path, you actually feel things more, but they hurt you less. You feel things more because you're more open, you're more in contact with reality. You're actually, when the whole duality thing breaks down, this is again what Ramana Maharshi said so beautifully. When he was once asked, how do we best help others? He said, what others? I mean, at the highest levels, there is no other. There is no other. And so when you bring this level of wisdom, applied wisdom is compassion. And so this is also really important, because otherwise you just, even in the spiritual thing, if you're just going up the emptiness thing, achieving arhathood or first world egolessness, that's ultimate liberation for oneself. But then what about reality? What about others? How do you bring that into the world? How do you translate that? Just like translational research and science, spiritual translation, how do you take that and bring it into the world? Well, you do that by understanding that there is no other. So you feel things more because you're more open, you are in contact with others because at that point you are the other. And then the beauty of it is it hurts you less because you're no longer appropriating it, because there's no longer ego structure. There's no place for the pain to land. You still feel it, but like a neutrino, it just passes through you because you're not grasping after it. And because of this, you don't burn out. You don't have all these problems that many people do if they only hang out in the relative realm. You burn out. So I think dancing between these, evolution is marked by increased perspective. And there's a tremendous level of granularity with this increased perspective. But the biggest one really is being able to hold relative and absolute truths in harmony, in concert, both views.
Very interesting. Let me maybe play one more time a bit of the devil's advocate here.
Yeah, sure.
But when we speak about this classical Buddhist approach or kind of truism that it's your reaction to what is happening that is causing suffering, right? It's not the outer circumstances really, but it's how you choose to react to them or what power you attribute
100%.
to what is happening on the outside, how you allow that to influence your inner state. And I think there is incredible wisdom in it, right? And it is deeply empowering if you think that between, as Viktor Frankl said, kind of between this stimulus and the response, there is a space, right? And the more we can enlarge that space, the bigger our inner freedom. So we don't react automatically, but we can consciously respond. And so I love this concept, but still, if you take it to the extreme, and then let us speak of philosophers, for instance, a Slovenian philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, you might have heard of it, who's kind of a modern Marxist, right? He says, well, actually, Buddhism is the grease for the capitalist industrial machine, because what it does is it's kind of the ideological supplement to it, because instead of bringing people to the streets because there is potentially an unjust, oppressive, unfair, ecologically destructive, and soul-wrenching system, it says, well, sit down on the cushion and deal with it internally, right? So what is your take on that?
Yeah, first of all, with all due respect, that's incredibly misinformed and naive. It's borderline silly. It's highly revelatory and indicative of his lack of understanding of this tradition. So this is where you need to work with, and you've nailed it yourself, the difference between reactivity and responsibility. That so much here, my friend. So the initial vectors of the Buddhist tradition. So this is one thing I might reply to this individual is he needs to understand the various traditions, the schools, and that, yes, at entry-level, provisional levels, called the Theravada, Hinayana, called narrow vehicle, you work on your stuff. Like when I did my 3-year retreat, I go into retreat to work on my stuff. Because if I don't understand my mind, my heart, how do I even have a hope of understanding reality in the world, which is completely plastered with my projections? Or if you look at the work of Carl Friston and active inference, reality, inference is a handshake with reality. we're just projecting, we're painting the world constantly with our projections. Even the fact that there is a seeming world out there, that itself is a projection. So you have to start with yourself, because otherwise, how can you effectively help others? How can you centrifuge out what's really happening from your projections onto what's happening? And very briefly, because there's so much to say here, a very powerful psychological maxim that applies here is when a situation affects you more than it informs you, you're dealing with a projection. When you react more than you respond, you're dealing with a projection. And so we're affected and reactive all the time because we're always projecting. So if we can take responsibility, it's literally called the path of cleaning up, own up our projections, we clean up ourselves, we clean up the world, then we're no longer reactive. Now we can respond in a sensitive, intelligent way because we have a much clearer understanding. Appearance is in harmony with reality. We know WTF is happening because we're not projecting a world in our image. So yes, on one level, at first, you could say that's selfish. I mean, that to me is a raging misunderstanding. You have to work with yourself in order to see through yourself. And then from there, the Hinayana then matures into the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. And so he obviously has no understanding of this. Then you get up off the cushion spontaneously. And there are methods that help you if it doesn't happen spontaneously, because the wisdom that you've worked with on the Hinayana level then is applied as compassion. Applied wisdom is compassion. Suzuki Roshi again comes to the rescue when he says, strictly speaking, there are no enlightened beings, there's only enlightened activity. And so at the level of the Mahayana, the practitioner automatically gets up to help the world and engage and protest and march and activate. Activism is a natural consequence of this, because when they see the world and people that are suffering in it, they're suffering. Again, there is no out there. There is no other. So they spontaneously then, using their compassion, step into the world, and every breath, every activity is in the service of others. And then, there's one more vehicle, but those are the two principal ones. So I think just a deeper understanding of what the Buddhist tradition is, not limiting merely to the Theravada and Hinayana, understanding the role of the Mahayana tradition, then this argument just doesn't hold up at all.
Well, thank you for this response. And I mean,
hard stop.
To be fair, like in Zizek's kind of defense, he mostly refers to the Western version of Buddhism that is uprooted from kind of the traditional.
Yes, and there's some. Well, that's good to hear. I wish I would have known that in advance, because that's really important. The secularization of Buddhism. Taking it out of its context, transforming meditation, which was never meant for all the things that it's being used for today, taking it out of its context and poorly translating it into Western culture. And so parenthetically, I guess when people ask me, just like my thing, what do I do? Well, I'm a cultural translator. I mean, part of my job, as I look back over 50 years, is, well, maybe I'm able to take some of these wisdom streams and bring them into Western cultural milieus and environments through the vocabulary, the language, the cultural context of science, philosophy, psychology, and the like. So anyway, that's helpful to understand. So I'm sure I hate to be critical of anybody, but what you share doesn't land with me. If there's more of this kind of contextual thing, then there's probably some real wisdom in what he's saying. So when you're supposed to be able to.
Again, because it was due to my own imprecise language, but I still think that a lot of people would agree with his argument in general, right? That we shouldn't just sit on the cushion. We should go out on the streets. And in the end, I think why
can't you do both? Why can't you do both?
Exactly.
Because
I believe that from deeper understanding of the self and of the nature of reality, and a more enlightened activism can arise, right? An activism that is not driven by rage and anger and also kind of, just willingness to disrupt and destroy, but something that by its own presence transforms, right? It's what Ram Dass calls, you have activisms who say, we will fight until there is peace, versus the enlightened activist who says, I am peace, so may there be peace in the world, right? And this is a completely different way of relating to the world. And you said there is basically no spiritual path without actual practice, and makes things juicy and interesting. And so I wanted to talk with you about different ways of practicing. And so I think you have coined the term reverse meditation, which I find very interesting. Could you expand on that, what you mean by this, and kind of what is regular meditation and what is reverse meditation?
Yeah. Okay. One minor point of maybe clarification from my side when I talk about practice and what practice is about. These are just different ways to work with a vast um, spectrum of the human condition, the mind and the heart. That's what practice is all about. How do we work with the mind and the heart? Which, by the way, in both Pali and Sanskrit are the same word. So anytime I use the word mind, the word chitta is heart mind. So with that said, yeah, I mean, of the 10 books I've written, all 10 of them circumambulate this core topic of meditation, transformation, the affecting of transformation. So reverse meditation, I think written 2 books ago. By the way, I did not make this term up. It comes from the Mahamudra tradition. So for the listeners who know, I learned this in my 3-year retreat in the context of what I call the Mahamudra, the great symbol teachings. And in the tradition itself, there's not a great deal of unfolding of this concept. But when I read about that and I practiced it in a very brief way in retreat, I said, oh my gosh, there is so much here. So I came out of retreat. I started working with it quite extensively. And I feel so excited to share and bring this form of practice to the world because it's so needed in a time like ours. And so reverse meditations are called that because they reverse our relationship. Here's that term that we've been circumambulating for the last 40 minutes. The difference in what Viktor Frankl was talking about, the space between stimulus and response. Everything really is brought about, whether we suffer or not, by not phenomenal arising, but how we relate to phenomenal arising. So the issue isn't what arises in our minds. The issue isn't so much what arises in so-called external reality. The issue is how we relate to it. Again, relating to it instead of from it, responding instead of reacting. But the reverse meditations are really brilliant because they vastly expand our notion of what meditation and contemplative practice is by bringing unwanted experiences onto the path. And so in this age of the meta crisis, have you noticed? There's no shortage of unwanted experiences. And so do we run from them or do we work with them? And so the reverse meditations, they're called reverse because you reverse your normal feel-good strategies. Authentic psychospiritual growth is not about feeling good, unless you're talking about the fundamental teaching of basic goodness. It's about getting real. And getting real means dealing with challenging situations like old age, sickness, and death, or everything else that's happening in the world. And so with this extraordinary skill set, armed with this skill set and the steps of working with it, one can take even the most challenging, like death, you could say, arguably the most unwanted of all experiences. Well, if you relate to it properly using reverse meditation strategies, obstacle transforms into opportunity, and it is the most transformative of all experiences. And so I playfully say, by putting your meditation in reverse, you'll find yourself going forward. Because with the reverse meditations, nothing can interrupt your meditation. Interruption becomes your meditation. Nothing can distract you because distraction becomes your meditation. And so this is why, armed with these tools, we can enter really challenging personal and collective situations, not be thrown by unwanted circumstance, but actually engage it in a really intelligent way instead of contracting, open to it, relate to it in this more expansive way, and in so doing, transforming it. So yeah, there's so much to say here. Like there's a whole book on it. But briefly, this is just armchair philosophizing. No, I'm a retired dental surgeon, so I work in the pain business. I've written hundreds of thousands of prescriptions for narcotics. I've been involved with really intensive physical pain. I've been involved in studies around physical pain. I've been subjects in studies working with meditators in pain. So again, I bring a broad spectrum approach, physiological, spiritual, psychological. It's not just armchairing here. It's how do we really take this unwanted, let's just say physical pain, how do we take this inevitable lifetime partner and transform it into an ally, something that we can really learn to befriend, to accept, to grow with. And therefore we have the wherewithal, we have the courage, we have the openness, the heart and the mind to enter really, really difficult situations, because we can then bring our openness, our sanity, and our kindness to help with others. So the reverse meditations they're pure gold in my own world, with really intense physical pain, emotional heartbreak. They just have so much power. So I'll pause there depending on where you want to go with it. But yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. And maybe you can give us an example of how one would work with, be it emotional or physical pain.
Yeah, sure. So I could, yeah. So the first thing is, again, it's about, number one is just the overarching view of establishing a new relationship to unwanted experience, like pain, for instance. I mean, have you ever, if you ever were to pull somebody off the street or talk to your friends and say, "Hey, have you ever taken any time to become familiar with your pain?" They would say, "Dimitri, what have you been drinking, man?" No, I'm not interested in relating to my pain. I'll drink a beer, I'll take some drugs, I'll distract myself, whatever. So even right there, just understanding that the principal transformational mode that's taking place is altering of one's relationship. And so this starts very simply. There's 4 steps to this. I can go through them pretty quickly. Doesn't
Yes.
mean you're going to get this right away, but the first one is kind of the observational phase, where in other words, let's say you have a broken leg or something. You have some physical pain. It doesn't matter. It can be emotional pain. It really just doesn't matter. It is kind of a one size fits all practice. And honestly, in my opinion, I use it much more with emotional pain than I do physical pain because my heart is broken these days a lot more than my body's broken. I mean, every time I turn on the news and I mean, look, my God, what's happening in Iran, right? I mean, it's unbelievably painful. So whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, it really doesn't matter. But the idea is the first thing is to notice, just observe, notice. What do you notice when you have this pain? Do you notice a contraction, for instance? Do you notice an openness to it? Most of the time when people have unwanted experience, they feel some type of contraction. Defensively, they'll literally defend and contract against it. You can feel that in your body. You can feel yourself defend against it. So the first step right there is just the observational one, just paying, witness awareness quality to what's arising. That in itself starts to transform it because you're already starting to hold it in a different crucible. The relationship is changing just by holding, not grasping, but literally holding to the experience, having this new holding environment. So briefly, the second step would be just be with it. Just the first part is observe it. Second one is be with it. That literally means, okay, I'm in pain, my heart's broken. Instead of running to the TV, to the alcohol cabinet, to distraction, I'm just going to allow myself to be with this discomfort. That's a pretty big reverse strategy right there, right? This is where the reverse really
Yeah.
comes in because we want hurt. We're hurt. We want out. Well, Trungpa Rinpoche said, you mentioned him earlier beautifully, there is no way out. The magic is to discover that there's a way in. This is the non-dual approach. So you be with it. And that's not easy when you're in physical pain. That's not easy when your heart is broken. So you want to befriend it, become familiar with it. The very term for meditation in the Tibetan language, Gom, Gom, to become familiar with. Be with the pain, just be with it. What is it like if you just with it? That itself will also really start to transform it just by the act of being with it. It's almost like if you have a child and they're having a tantrum, you just hold it. You create this holding environment of love and kindness, and eventually that in itself transforms. You don't have to fix anything, you just hold it. That's the crucible of transformation. So the third step, and the latter two, these latter two are very transformative and very profound. So with these first 2 stages, observe it, be with it. Third phase, now you become more curious, good scientist, analytic meditation, examine it. What is this thing called pain? Really? What is it? What is it made of? I mean, you start to be curious. What is the nature of this heartbreak? You could say, where am I feeling it if you want? The idea is to feel it, but not feed it. Explore it. Be curious. What is this thing I spend my entire lifetime trying to run from? What is it? So you'll inquire. Again, this is a wonderful way to send your mind in the opposite direction, which would be usually run from it. No, now you stay with it, you go into it, examine it. And what is the nature of this? The last question of this third step, which leads magnificently to the fourth, and then I'll pause, is not so much examining the unwanted experience, the broken heart or the physical pain, but examining the experiencer. Who is feeling this pain? You see where we're going here? This is big. Who is feeling this pain? So now you're shifting your lens from the experience to the experiencer. This is a game changer. So again, so much to say here, but for purposes of time, that leads beautifully to the fourth stage, which is now you do the full reverse Monty. And you work literally to dissolve into the pain, become one with it, yoke with it. And this is magnificent. Like T.S. Eliot said of music, music heard so deeply, it is not heard at all. You become the music while the music lasts. Or Trungpa Rinpoche again, the master. And this following line was just stunning in its profundity. I'm going to toss it out here somewhat, I wouldn't say flippantly, but quickly. But if you just wrap your mind around this following statement, this will change your life. If you simply become one, right? Become one with your dualistic experience. Experience your dualistic experience, whatever it is, fully, completely, absolutely. That is a non-dual experience. Let me say that again. Feel whatever you're feeling 100%. That dualistic experience becomes a non-dualistic experience. And so the profound revelation here is that if you become one with your pain, there's no one to hurt. There's just this sensation that we append the label pain to. And this is why you can look, I mean, you look at a really stunning example of this is Thich Quang Duc, the self-immolating monk in the Vietnamese War. Check out this video, right? The burning monk. How on earth is it humanly possible for a human being to sit, complete stationary meditation posture without flinching while his body's being burned alive by gasoline? Well, it's because fire can't burn space. And so I can't say for sure this gentleman was doing reverse meditation. Who knows? Maybe he was doing what's called Nirodha Samapati. I don't know. But one way or the other, I can tell you what, he had a radically different relationship to his pain. Otherwise, there's no way he could sit in meditative equipoise when he's literally going up in fire. So I'll pause because, again, there's so much to say here, and I apologize for going so quickly. But I have a lot of passion around these practices from my own clinical experience and my own lived experience. I mean, I use these things every day of my life. And it creates this, just like space itself, it creates this indestructible quality of mind, this crucible, this infinite holding environment that allows one to accept, relate to anything that arises. It's a game changer. So I'll pause there because otherwise we'll be here for 3 hours.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we need a part two because there's so many questions I still want to ask.
Yeah.
And I don't even want to kind of change the subject yet again, talk about dream yoga and darkness, because I think we can talk an hour on each. But so maybe I would like to stay a bit more on this topic because I feel like for so many listeners, it is really revelatory and life-changing, right? If you understand that the waves can't hurt the ocean, so to speak. And that's, I guess, really, really helpful for our kind of daily struggles, right? For the stress and the fears and the anxiety that many of us feel in these times. I think also what comes at play is one of the equations you talked about, right? And I mean, some people might be familiar with it, right? That kind of suffering equals pain times resistance. And maybe you can explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, more important than E equals MC squared. Yeah, S equals P times R. Well, again, you look at your own experience and just see if this is in fact the case. Suffering equals pain times resistance. What you resist persists. And so if you do just a very little bit of basic math, if you drop the resistance, you drop the suffering. Suffering is a construct. Suffering is, again, here's the term relationship again. Look what you experience. Suffering is just an inappropriate relationship to pain. And so because it's an inappropriate relationship, you can make that relationship appropriate. You can change the relationship. You can deconstruct suffering because it is a construct. And you can return, so to speak, you can reduce suffering back to its substrate, which is pain. And then even further than this, like in the fourth step, you can then even further deconstruct pain itself. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing left. No. There's still something there. But it's just not this thing we label pain. I mean, I can give you the answer, but it don't mean anything until you actually do it. What's left when you go through this non-dualistic demolition derby is just nothing more than really raw, intense sensory awareness. What's left is mind. That's all there is. And so if you understand this, then again, then you have the courage to drop the resistance, which is really hard. Because not only is this biologically hardwired into our system, right? This is not just merely an acculturation. This is not just merely cultural. This is biological. Again, if we didn't have these avoidance strategies in our genetic makeup, we wouldn't be here talking about this. So I'm not dissing these I wouldn't say provisional, but entry-level evolutionary strategies to pain. We need them. But when we're trying to grow into psychospiritual dimensions, the biological drivers, propellers that bring us to this point become the evolutionary drivers, become devolutionary retardants. So the very principles that brought us to this particular point in evolution that we absolutely positively need, which again is why we need this dual perspectivalism, we need these perspectives. But then if we want to grow beyond, this is one reason why there's so few people that are awake. Because if they don't understand these fundamental principles, they don't realize proper relationships to these drivers, how to transcend but include them. See? So you still have these things operating. I'm still in a heap of hurt. I'm not just going to sit on my meditation cushion and try to meditate it away. No, I'm going to go see my doctor. I'm going to do what I need to do. But there are a lot of instances where I don't have recourse to medication. So then I have meditation. Sorry, I couldn't help it. And then, so yes, there becomes just extraordinarily applicable. Drop the resistance. That's what brings you away. Turn, do the reverse, go into the unwanted experience. Again, don't take my word for this. Try it for yourself. And you'll notice that you'll touch into it, you'll contract away. You'll touch into it, you'll contract away. This is crazy. This is ridiculous. You touch into it, it hurts, you contract. You touch into it, you hurt, it contracts. Well, in that moment of contraction away from it, that's right when you transform simple pain into complex suffering. And so you work, you counteract it, you open to it, don't contract, open, open, open. Meditation, my favorite definition, habituation to openness. When you open, accept, and go into it, try it, see for yourself. Everything starts to change because your relationship changes. So this is something, again, this is highly empirical. This is not theoretical. This is not philosophical. It's highly empirical. You just have to do it for yourself, and most people won't. Because who in their right mind, right? Who in their right mind wants to go into difficult situations like my 3-year retreat, or my dark retreats? Who on earth wants to do that? It's not easy. It's hard. Well, you really want to grow in this life? You follow your fear. You follow your pain. Don't just follow your bliss. Go to the places that scare you. This is tantric practice. Go to the challenging zones. That's where growth takes place.
Mm. So going to the places that scare you, that hurt, I think can be and is tremendously powerful and transformative, and I guess necessary. And at the same time, when we bring this concept of trauma-informed meditation to awareness, people who have been hurt so badly, psychologically, emotionally, or even physically, who have a capital T trauma, right?
Yeah.
Even the thought of kind of approaching the pain might be already overwhelming. And so,
that's right.
What is your stance on that? What is a wise approach to that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for bringing that up. Honoring, integrating, incorporating all the standard approaches to trauma. So this is where you can get into big spiritual bypass. Saying, oh, I'm just going to do my reverse strategy thing and I'm going to go into my trauma and it's going to take care of it all. I am not saying that. I'm saying use this practice in conjunction with, in concert with these other approaches. If you do that, then you can do things like desensitization approaches, exposure therapy, all the amazing things that are done with trauma work. And all the while, perhaps holding in your mind that it might in fact not be possible that trauma is chronic contraction. That's what trauma is. It's chronic contraction. And so if you understand the processes, the phenomenology of contraction and openness, then you can eventually, and I think this is actually quite true, if we don't have the data on it, but if one worked with this approach, with these fundamental modalities, working to open, release these chronic contractions, then you could say theoretically, and I say this with some qualification because we just don't know, that these reverse strategies could be extraordinarily effective with things like internal family systems, with traditional trauma work, with Bessel-van der Kolk's work and the like. Because again, what are you doing when you're working with all EMDR and all these other approaches? Take a look under the process, the phenomenology of all these techniques. You're going to find alterations in relationship. Fundamentally, that's what's going on. And so if you understand, like, where's a primordial contraction coming from, for instance, and if you look at this in terms of this underlying narrative of contraction, this can be really, really compelling. really helpful. I mean, that's what the self is, by the way. I say this, I talk a lot about contraction. If you read the reverse meditation book, there's quite a bit of material on openness and contraction. And in this book, just brief sidebar to show you how deep it goes, I talk about descending from higher order colloquial contractions. Like when you're really irritated, annoyed, look into your body. What are you feeling? Oh, okay, you're right. I'm feeling some defensive contraction. You're feeling pain, fear, panic. What are you feeling? You're feeling some contraction. So what I invite listeners, readers to explore again for yourself, it's not like the Hindu myth. It's not turtles all the way down. It's contractions all the way down. And if you work your way down through these skill sets, and this, by the way, is what Dark Retreat does, we can talk about later next time, you're going to work your way down to the primordial contraction. And then I pause here for just a second, and I ask people, what might that primordial contraction actually feel like? The root trauma. I mean, this is the root trauma upon which all other traumas build their house, so to speak. What does a primordial contraction feel like? Me. It feels like the very sense of self. So underneath this all, this shows you how deep this goes. The primordial contraction is the very sense of self. Born of the trauma of, I mean, I don't want to go too far because I have roadkill here, but there is a reason for this root trauma. You know, why do we contract? Not merely in self-defense, but in self-generation, because the self is embodied contraction. And so if we understand that, the very sense of self, that is the primordial trauma encapsulated in this very body. And so if you understand this and really explore this, this is a game-changing set of exploration. So yeah, I'll pause there because we might trip into metaphysical waters where we could lose some people. So I'll stop.
I mean, I find this fascinating, and actually, I want to go deeper, but I also want to honor our agreement because you have a hard deadline, and I want to respect that. But this topic with the self being actually the primordial contraction, it's such a deep observation, and yet a lot of but what pop up in my mind, and maybe that's something that we might discuss at a later point. Andrew, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. It was a fascinating discussion. I love your precision and your clarity, and above all, your humble stance and openness towards to learn, to combine different traditions and really not be dogmatic about one approach. And I think this is really, really helpful. And I'm sure all the people who listen to you and who love you is because of that. And so,
That's very kind. Yeah.
Really big gratitude from my side for being here with us. Thank you so much. And if people want to find more about your work and the workshops and your books, where should they look?
Yeah. So, you know, one last thing, what you said about this openness thing, you know, I mean, one of the things I really like about Socrates that I live by is the only difference between you and me is I know that I don't know. And so that level of openness and humility for me, I mean, it's like, I definitely don't have the final word on any of this stuff. I have these particular subscriptions, and I don't always, but sometimes say my biggest challenge is to let these subscriptions run out. So I have these particular views. Are they absolute views? For me, they seem to be, but I could be completely wrong. The Dalai Lama said this of Buddhism. I mean, how many world religious leaders would say this? If science comes up with material discoveries that contradict the teachings of the Buddhist tradition, the Buddhist tradition needs to capitulate. I mean, that's extraordinary. So to me, yeah, the open humility, I mean, it's kind of funny because even talking about humility is self-aggrandizing, right? Oh, I'm so humble. I'm so open, right? You can't even talk about it without shooting yourself in the foot. But I appreciate the comment. I try. I really do try. And I also just relax and enjoy the ride. I mean, the whole thing is just a delightful, delightful ride. So people can find out about me, you know, my website, andrewholecek.com. We have a big booming platform called Night Club, which supports the nocturnal meditations. We have a new website coming up actually just this week to support the dark retreat practices, because that's my next series of books is going to be on that topic. And then I have my own podcast platform called Edge of Mind, which is a free going thing. But thank you so much for the plug. I appreciate it. It's such a delight to spend time with you, Dimitri. Great questions, sensitivity. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And yeah, we can come back a little bit later, you know, maybe after my book comes out and we can talk about dark matters, because as I playfully like to say, you know, my charter now in the world is I'm trying to bring darkness into the world.
I love it. We need more of your darkness.
Yeah, too much light in the world right now. Way too much light pollution. So thank you so much for the opportunity. You're a delight to spend time with. Yeah, let's do it again sometime, and super appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Take care, my friend.
Thank you so much for listening to Inner Pioneers. If you found this conversation meaningful, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone you care about. Want to go deeper? Visit evolute-institute.com. Until then, keep pioneering one step at a time.